Hello again, Matt.
Hi, how are you?
I am looking forward to this conversation. Been looking forward to it for a long time, but we've had...
I know, this is something we wanted to do earlier, but I got a Nepo eviction, as you might have heard, and so I bought a house, a new debt peonage system.
Yep.
I can see every time I check my account, and so I'm dealing with noise in my house and moving boxes.
Welcome to that club. You have moved ahead of me. Leave me in the dust.
You're in the lower class system of debt, so...
I am in the lower class system. I don't know that I'll ever join that club, but you never know. In this conversation, I want to continue this conversation about housing. Our last one was called Free Housing for All. We made arguments for the human right to housing.
The rights-based claim.
The rights-based claims to housing as part of the framework of the Golden Square we talk about often is food, shelter, healthcare, and education. Shelter, second most important one. And the key part of that is housing. And so, therefore, free housing for all. And we spent a lot of time talking about that. But we didn't get into the weeds about how we get to free housing. How do we get to a reality of fully decommodified housing? We said we were going to do that. So that's what we're hoping we do in this conversation is try to trace that path towards full decommodification. So what I wanted to start with before we dive into everything I've got planned here is sort of an acknowledgement of the reality about housing and about the so-called housing problem. That reality is that we already live in post-scarcity. That nation states could make free housing for all a reality. They could have long ago, but they could do that tomorrow just by way of legislative dictate if that was the political reality, if that was the common sense that organized our world. Because it's not for lack of resources. So we spend a lot of time talking about how there isn't a shortage of housing. It isn't for the lack of the technology or the means to do it. It's just the lack of the political reality to make it possible.
It's fundamentally the quote-unquote common sense is blocked by the fact that housing is very much, at the end of the day, is very much a local, city, provincial concern of the county, of the cities. And who owns them? Land developers. If you look at county board races, if you look at supervising positions on land management in counties and in cities, as well as unincorporated areas, it's the land developers that own the political viability of all of this.
Yeah. The reality of acknowledging and providing housing as a human right is being blocked, like you said, at the local level by those who are controlling the state. And we say that the state could do this tomorrow if there was the political common sense to make that so, but of course they won't. We're not under any illusions that that's going to happen. Of course they won't, because that's not why states exist in the first place. States exist in the first place to maintain and replicate institutions of hierarchy, dominance, and control, right?
States are cages.
States are cages. And so the cage exists specifically to do this, to prevent us from having what we need. So we're under no sort of delusion that there's some sort of magic solution that's going to happen from the benevolent state to give us what we need. But I do think it's important to ground ourselves in that acknowledgement that it's not a lack of technology or solutions or any of that that's keeping us from a reality of housing for all. It is the structures of the state and our shared politics. Because if we lived in actual democracies, which we don't, democracy is always a dream. If we lived in an actual democracy, decommodification would be happening. We would be moving away from housing as a commodity. But to get to full decommodification of housing is a potentially long process, long and winding road to what really should be right around the corner. So we need an ecology of tactics and potentially many different types of solutions to get there. So what we're going to do is look at some of those, and what we're going to use in this conversation as a combined rubric for assessing all of these potential and or actual solutions.
And this rubric will be in the show notes. So if you want to work through it yourself or come back to us and listen to the rest of the podcast having filled out the worksheet yourself, you can be part of that conversation.
Yeah. The first part of it, we're going to borrow from something that is often part of these conversations. Since last year when we did a deep dive discussion on Eric Olin Wright's book, How to Be an Anti-Capitalist in the 21st Century, he talks about in that book 5 strategic logics historically of anti-capitalist struggle. So first, we're going to look at each of these potential solutions according to these 5 different anti-capitalist strategic logics and assess whether or not they are anti-capitalist. And if they are, do they fall within one or more of these kind of strategic logics? And so this is a 2x2 sort of sociological grid. One axis is the level of the system, and the other is the objective of the struggle. And so the 5 strategic logics are these. So the first is taming capitalism, and these are approaches to the struggle that seek to neutralize harms of capitalism, but not to attempt to replace capitalism. So this is just to neutralize, tame the harms.
Taking out some of the poison.
Yeah, this is harm reduction sort of stuff. So this is the kind of things that are typified by social democrats, and those sorts of folks, those sorts of liberals. The next one is resisting capitalism, and approaches to resisting capitalism seek to alleviate harms of the capitalist state, but not to capture state power. So you can think of things like workplace union organizing as falling into this sort of paradigm, seeking to create some sort of autonomy within the system and to alleviate harms, but not necessarily to change the system itself. The next one is dismantling capitalism. This is an anti-capitalist approach that works more on transcending the structures of capitalism and the capitalist state by enacting programs that reduce harm and dismantle capitalism, but at the same time to provide alternative to the capitalist state. So to build up alternatives through sustained action through the state. So this would be the most radical left in the typical conception of left-right sort of politics that you would see. So you think of the Squad in the U.S. and Democratic Socialists, Bernie Sanders and the Squad and folks like that, Justice Democrats, those sorts of folks that are mostly aimed at sort of state socialist solutions.
They're basically trying to and create public purpose investments that partially decommodify in some sense. It's still an acceptance of the market, but I think that's part of what it's doing. It's kind of recommoning things and creating common purpose.
Yes. And then the fourth strategic logic is escaping capitalism. So these are, think of like the hippies, I think a lot, as typifying this sort of approach. It's like, we can't fight the system, so we need to escape the system. You can't fight City Hall, so you gotta do something outside of that.
Example of that would be, and I think Eric Olin defends things like food not bombs, but those are examples of what would look like if you're trying to escape it. You're creating an alternative form or prefigurative movement. So I think if you're thinking of prefigurative politics, escaping politics is creating alternative models that exist outside of, not inside, but outside of capitalism.
And then the fifth and final strategic logic that he defines is smashing capitalism, which he thinks of as not a realistic or viable approach. So it doesn't include it within his overall conception to erode capitalism in the 21st century.
He's thinking, of course, the Marxist-Leninist notion of smashing the state and taking it over. And he said that was a failure and that it's not a model we can look at. It's something that's been done in the past. And the Marxist-Leninist approach of co-opting or creating a uniparty structure has been a miserable failure. So he says that's all kind of off the table as a realistic goal. I think partially because, as like Emma Goldman has talked about this too, is it was minoritarian revolution. And when you have a minoritarian revolution, it's going to have hierarchies just by their nature of being minoritarian, and that they're also going to be self-defeating.
Not exclusively the domain of Marxist-Leninist revolutionaries, but the idea of smashing capitalism would be one of a total revolutionary systems ruptures, the sort of spontaneous revolution. So whether it's Marxist-Leninist or some other conception of that, it is the sort of unrealistic idea.
This is the kind of thinking where he said, like, everyone get out on the streets and something magical will happen.
Yes,
if we just hit the streets, we'll change it all.
Right. So these 5 logics of anti-capitalism, taming, resisting, dismantling, escaping, and smashing. That's our first set of criteria we're going to look at.
Anti-capitalist strategic logics,
We're going to look at each of these housing problem solutions and see whether or not they fall into any of these. And then the second part of the rubric, the second 2 parts actually, we're going to borrow from the work of Saoirse Gowan and Ryan Cooper, which you can find in initially a paper that was put out by the People's Policy Project in 2018 called Social Housing in the United States. And then expanded or drawn from that, there's a piece in Jacobin's spring 2019 issue called How to Solve the Housing Problem, in which they used these 2 measures of assessing some of these housing problem solutions First being political viability within the current political context, and the second, effectiveness. How effective is the solution in addressing the overall housing problem? So that's our combined rubric. Eric Olnwright and Saoirse Gowan and Ryan Cooper's assessment measures, we're going to use those to talk about each of these housing problem solutions. So what follows, what we're going to look through in the rest of this conversation, is an admittedly incomplete list of so-called housing problem solutions. But we're going to trace everything from the bare minimum types of homelessness crisis response measures all the way to things that would be on the doorstep of the utopian horizon. And I've divided these into three categories, the first of which is access solutions that are mostly about houselessness or homelessness crisis. The second being affordability. And then the final section being on decommodification measures. We will attempt to trace some of the main avenues in the long, winding journey toward the full decommodification of housing as a guaranteed human right. You ready, Matt?
I'm ready.
You got your worksheet there. We'll go through this. So the first section is access. So solutions that are about access to housing. And the first one here is encampments. When we say encampments, we're talking about designated spots for the unhoused, for homeless populations to camp up. These are in cities all over the place, but we'll leave links to articles about some of these more recent ones. So like in East Hollywood, where I used to live, there is an encampment that's in a designated parking lot owned by the city where they've marked out 12-foot by 12-foot spots for people to put tents. Cities like Austin made it permissible in the city, legal in the city.
Decriminalization of encampments is clear because we're not talking about encampments, which I think would be more like resisting because they're a daily reminder of the problem of capitalism. They're resisting by basically direct action / survival. These are designated locations that are safe spaces or safe zones, kind of ironically a lot like free speech zones, where the state says, here you can actually do the thing that you should normally be able to do. And I remember hearing about in the foreclosure crisis where Portland and other cities just actually had to finally acknowledge them instead of breaking them up.
Right. Typically, unhoused folks are chased away from everywhere.
Traumatized.
Yeah. These are locations that are designated as permissible locations to camp if you don't have secure housing.
And that difference matters even though it's entirely pathetic because they're not haunted by the constant harangue of police cops and helicopters and dogs. And feeling violated and lacking safety.
And certainly through the duration of the COVID crisis, this has been an approach that cities across the continent at least have been embracing a little more as their solution to keep unhoused populations safe within the city. So we mentioned in the show description in the last episode, the measure in Las Vegas during the height of the pandemic lockdowns. And this has also been something in San Francisco recently. There's been a lot of designated parking lots for unhoused encampments. But how would you assess encampments as a solution to housing problems, Matt?
Well, in terms of anti-capitalist strategic logics, I don't even want to mark anything on it. It's so pathetic.
This is not.
I guess it's taming. I mean, it's harm reduction because once again, you're not going to be attacked by cops. So,
Well, presumably.
And, who knows if cops will
the
follow
cops know
those
where
policies.
to go to.
Exactly. You're still there. There's still the ever-present anxiety that it might be canceled on you. But I want to mark nothing on this. But I did put taming.
I would say that encampments are not an anti-capitalist solution.
That's what I was feeling about it too.
They, in fact, quite the opposite. They're a capitalist solution because they are part of maintaining a houseless population.
We're in creating labor discipline. You have to remember the unsheltered are an example of how the capitalist class creates labor discipline. So if you are frustrated by your abject wages in the United States, well, you could be homeless. Right. That's always like
we wrote in the show description, the last one characterizing the Las Vegas encampment during the height of the pandemic is virtually an open air prison. And so effectively it's psychological control for the rest of the population, like be on display as this is what will happen
what happens
to you
if you wave your finger at us.
So I mean, I guess a liberal assessment very generous liberal assessment might be that it is maybe taming, but I would say no, this isn't anti-capitalist at all. And therefore, I think in terms of viability, political viability and effectiveness, I would say obviously it's very high. This is the most viable thing.
They love it.
They love it. So that's why we see this in the capitalist state everywhere.
We won't destroy you, so we'll just create a safe space for you.
And basically, we could stop here if we were talking about what the state does to address housing problem. This is kind of like their limit.
This is like 90% of what they do.
All of the fucking emails that I get from representatives in the city council from LA, they're always celebrating more encampments as if this is the solution to our problems. So I would say, obviously, politically, this is very high. This is like the height of political viability in our current system, but zero effectiveness, like opposite of effective.
Mm-hmm. So politically, the highest possible, easiest branch to grab, but like 1% effective.
Yeah. At most, maybe limits a little harm to some folks. The next one is measures for temporary housing. So these we conventionally think of as homelessness shelters or emergency shelters and or transitional housing. These are
bridge housing sometimes.
Actual shelters, whether they're for individual and or group, but actual shelters for temporary use by the unhoused. So this would be one step up from a designated place to put a tent or to sleep outdoors. But I think this is what we think of typically as the standard homelessness crisis intervention, don't you think?
Yeah. This is considered the more like far-reaching and creative aspects of the state.
Right.
This is where like I'm really like a lefty.
Oh, yeah. I really care about people. I want them
and it's
to
often gobbled up by the nonprofit sector, right? So nonprofits are the ones that push against the encampments by trying to create temporary shelter. And that's where you talk about effectiveness, because the nonprofits aren't moving past this point very often.
Yeah, no. And I would include in this category of solutions schemes like those in LA, for instance, that are using repurposing shipping containers and or creating prefabricated tiny homes and putting those in an area. Basically, like you take the encampment parking lot, but put some pods in there.
I think of them more like rundown places the city retrofits for a transitional temporary housing. Not so much like independent small homes per se, because I think that's a little bit more permanent because they're basically creating buildings and structures for them and themselves. But I would say that this is very much within the realm of charity.
Yeah.
And I think that's why nonprofits are so involved with it, because so many nonprofits are not really interested in dismantling or smashing or escaping capitalism. They're often function as charity houses.
Right.
So this is their little wheelhouse.
And this is what probably gets the largest coverage in media.
Yeah.
This is where you'll have the most column inches in stories about this, because this is the limit of what liberal politicians will attempt to do in addressing the problem. And so there's a lot of discourse, or not just a lot of bullshit about how much it's going to, quote unquote, cost taxpayers and bullshit like this. But
and conservatives would support this if it was through Christian organizations.
Right.
So that's their arm of the nonprofit sector, is the be indoctrinated with baby Jesus. So
this is what Jesus would do, temporary
we'll
housing.
be nice to you if you listen to baby Jesus.
Yeah. So I would say in terms of anti-capitalist logic that this, at most, just to be generous, we might say maybe taming.
Yeah.
At most, this is taming.
I put that down as taming as well, too.
And then I think in terms of political viability, this isn't the highest. I mean, I still think this is like a moderate to high political viability, but
let's say this. I would say if you're a liberal politician, it would be high.
Yeah.
If you're conservative, it would be moderate.
Yeah.
Depending on the political party.
Yeah. Yeah. And then in terms of effectiveness, it is better, obviously, than an encampment, like a camp area, but it's still very low. It's still very low to maybe low in terms of its effectiveness.
Yeah, I would still put it very low because it fundamentally doesn't decrease the unsheltered population.
No.
It becomes a way station. And one of the big problems with these temporary shelters is many of the unsheltered have pets, and they can't have pets. If they have substance abuse issues, they can't be there. So they're basically, it's already reemerging as a carceral state.
Yeah.
So these sheltered homes very much feel like different types of prisons.
Yep.
Instead of the outdoor open air prison, it's a carceral state that enacts further trauma by saying you're not fully human because you have substance issues or you have a pet.
Yeah. The next one is housing first solutions. Other names for this would be rapid rehousing or permanent supportive housing. So these are schemes like detailed in the People's Policy Project paper by Saoirse Gowan and Ryan Cooper, like the scheme in Finland they talk about that is called Housing First, to put unhoused folks into permanent housing. So this is kind of the peak of a liberal address of houselessness crisis, which is to just put them in permanent homes. So these are any sort of scheme that would provide people with affordable short-term rental housing and or subsidized housing and supportive services as the response to their being unhoused.
And what did you put down for that?
I think we can say that this has some anti-capitalist energy in it, and so maybe resisting.
Yeah, I put down resisting. As an anti-capitalist strategic logic, this would be like the lowest rung of resisting.
Yeah.
We're dealing with, which is the saddest, most pathetic parts right now. We're getting them out of the way. So this will get better as we work through this.
In terms of political viability, I think this is sort of the peak of what would be considered the most radical and or most liberal nonprofits, right? The most liberal nonprofits are going to be the ones that are like, we're doing rapid rehousing, permanent supportive housing, right? That work in this space.
It's the new edginess. Yeah, it's the new edginess of the nonprofit sector. I put for political viability. Once again, I've been marking Republican versus Democrat.
That's good.
Because this is they're usually
We're
one
talking about
spot
the states
between
here,
each
so
other, especially, And you'll start to see this disappear as we move farther down the list. But I put down that housing first policies would be low for conservatives and moderate for liberals.
Yeah.
I think
I'm right
this is the new symbol pirate location for liberals.
Yeah, I'm right with you there. I think so. And I think also for effectiveness, it falls within that same low to moderate range. It is definitely, theoretically, to a degree, what needs to be done, which is house people, right? Mm-hmm. But because it's all of these contingencies and only addresses the problem in the slightest kind of way, it's still a very low.
So if it was a liberal politician, it would probably have moderate outcomes.
Yeah.
If it was conservative, it would have low outcomes. It would be entirely symbolic and empty.
Yeah. The next one I want to talk about is seizing hotels.
So do you watch Democracy Now? Because this is the only place that talks about Democracy Now! Is the only thing that actually cares about protests and direct action. Right. That's why it's called Democracy Now. So, I have a friend that has a Tacoma First Housing project in Tacoma, and they seized hotels. We've seen also seizing homes as well as another more robust version of this. Mm-hmm. But this is definitely something that doesn't appear in the news as much as it should.
This is an approach to address the unhoused and provide housing to the unhoused. And there is a crisis context. We see this, and then a status quo context or a non-crisis context. So we saw this in the COVID crisis context. In things like in California, there was a project that was a state project to try to do this called Project Room Key. That was by all measure a failed project because it didn't seize hotels or enough of them or even near the target number of them. But during the height of the COVID crisis, there were 50,000 empty hotel rooms in LA. And so folks were using hashtag seize the hotels because there was funding available through FEMA to the city to get hotels and put people in them. And they only did a few thousand.
We had this happen in San Bernardino where we had a row of broken down, rundown motels and hotels near the Carousel Mall in San Bernardino, which used to be the prize downtown.
Right.
And the hotel owners wanted to take COVID money to house the unsheltered, and the surrounding business community, as well as people living in their actual homes, didn't want that, as well as the city council. So the money was not even taken because there was no political viability in it.
So there's sort of crisis, pandemic kind of context as this becomes a thing. But it's also, you can think of it as a more permanent thing too, that we should, as a sort of urban planning kind of measure, to not put all this money and infrastructure into hotels, but repurpose them for permanent housing for folks. So you could think of seizing hotels as a more permanent solution. But either way, that's the idea, is to use properties that are short-term rentals, hotels, motels, that sort of thing. And now we also would factor in there all of the properties that are more conventional housing units that are used exclusively for Airbnb and the like, or short-term vacation rentals and taking up that space. So what do you think in terms of an anti-capitalist logic? Does this fall?
I think it's resisting because you're flipping a finger off at the private property sector, which doesn't want property to be used unless it's used by the ruling class.
Yeah.
And so I think it's a definite more visual spectacle of resisting capitalism. It's a noble activity.
Yeah, I think in the crisis context, if it's for just temporarily, like these projects like Project Roomkey and others that would be using federal funding just to pay the hotel so they can use them for unhoused folks, I think that would be like a resisting. But if you took this approach in a more permanent thing to sort of have it be a permanent public housing, repurpose short-term rentals for permanent public housing, I think would be more of a dismantling kind of logic.
Absolutely. You can see some movements that do this. They want to go to the dismantling component, especially like completely empty, rundown hotels or motels that are just not in use. They're basically being collected as tax shelters.
Yeah.
That's where they could become dismantling mechanisms, but they are often resisting, and they can be sometimes a spectacle where it's trying to get into the news. And this is where when you get to political viability, I put low for that, but I put effectiveness is low to high. I put mark both because if it's moving towards a dismantling component where they're able to get the population to support it, then it actually has a high effectiveness rate. But generally it's low because why? Because the police usually get involved, and it's usually very temporary. It might even be worse than first housing because your hopes are dashed because you get sold out by the police and the city council.
Yeah, I'm with you on this. The viability is very low, as shown by the attempts around the country and in California, for instance, during the pandemic. But if it was transitioned into a more permanent strategy, I think it could have some moderate
if it had public support, if there was widespread mobilization. And this is where we thought might have happened with the COVID crisis, but it didn't.
Yeah. This is where in the approaches to addressing houselessness, a crisis like the pandemic could have been an opportunity to open up more leverage, but hasn't borne out that way. The final one in our access group is banning evictions. So we are recording this in the middle of July of 2021, and we are just a couple weeks away from the expiration of the federal moratorium in the states on evictions. Other localities have had different timelines for those pandemic eviction
And Biden's been kicking the can on this, which is, I think, a huge symbol of his whole presidential time in office is kicking the can.
Yeah. But I think this, in the same way we talked about seizing hotels, there's a crisis sort of context for this, and then there's the non-crisis or conventional context for this, which in either way, the measure is to prevent people from being evicted. And so now we're on the precipice of a potential catastrophe in terms of evictions, and we talked about some of the numbers about this in our last conversation. So this might be a real catastrophe we'll see play out in the next year or so. But either way, the thing is keeping people from being kicked out of their homes. What do you think in terms of an anti-capitalist logic for this?
I think it's taming because it's not debt cancellation. It's not an ownership process of purchasing the place where they're living. It's taming the worst aspects. And it's definitely kind of a cousin to charity.
Yeah.
So we're not getting rid of your debt problem. We're not getting rid of your health care problem with COVID. We're not getting rid of your job problem. But we're just going to keep you in the house and kind of just do a timeout.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree in the crisis context, it's just a taming. If evictions could be banned permanently, I think that becomes a different sort of assessment. If evictions were permanently banned, then you could maybe think of it as a dismantling kind of logic.
So similar to seizing hotels, there is a bridgeway function that could be installed in both of these, where they actually become much more interesting.
Yeah. Either way, though, I do think its political viability is fairly low. And as you see, there's that kicking the can thing.
I would say during a crisis like COVID, it's very high. It's being done on the federal level, which is the federal level is like the last thing that ever happens. Like, look at marijuana legalization. I would generally say that it's pretty moderate because we do have laws that allow for banning of evictions under certain criteria. So depending on the state and locale, there already is in law ways to ban evictions. But once again, I would say that it's really COVID that we're seeing it being implemented much more.
Yeah, I agree on those points. And I would say here that, we talked about some of the ways to get involved in building solidarity and organizing towards housing decommodification last time at the end of our conversation. One of the things we mentioned was tenants unions. And unfortunately, tenants unions, they vary from location to location, and some are more radical and bigger and have greater solidarity among members than others. But I think it would be fair to say that much of what takes up the time and energy of tenants unions and tenant organizers is resisting evictions and helping people, helping each other when they're facing potential evictions. And so, unfortunately, even though that is an entryway into the struggle around housing decommodification, I think so much of the energy is eaten up because it's such a crisis. So much is eaten up.
It's a defensive action, which the left is pretty much made its life history out of since the rise of neoliberalism, is largely defensive measures, harm reduction.
But like we mentioned, if this crisis expands and worsens, there may be many more of us needed on those front lines very soon to prevent our neighbors from being evicted or ourselves. That's the first part, access. The second section is affordability measures. And the first one would be canceling rent debt. So this is, again, like the last two, seizing hotels and banning evictions, something that we can see primarily existing within crisis contexts like the pandemic, but potentially as a more permanent kind of thing. So this would be any measure that would, and there are existing measures in piecemeal, there are all these means-tested ways to, like in California, there's a lot of unused funds currently available for rental assistance to help people pay off some of their back rent. We are currently in a circumstance in the States where there are millions of people who are behind on rent through the pandemic. Estimates around 10 million plus who are behind somewhere in the range of $5,000 or more in rent, in back rent, unpaid during the pandemic. We could also think of this as anytime you're unable to pay rent, you could have that canceled. Because rent in the first place is a form of debt, and debts can always be canceled. So whether we're talking about a sort of crisis like the one we're facing now in terms of back rent or everyday unpaid rents, these can always be canceled. So this is a strategy around canceling the unpaid rent. What do you think in terms of strategic logic?
If liberals and conservatives do it, it's more like resisting. If it's socialists, then it could be dismantling because it's a bridgeway.
Yeah.
Like we'll talk about this later, is this notion of the property tax as a way of creating an alternative funding mechanism to both decommodify housing and maintain access and affordability.
Yeah.
So I think, if a socialist were to do it, this is where socialists, if they get elected to office, they might be big pushers of this.
If this was a bridgeway to a more permanent sort of solutions to permanently cancel rent, then it's a strategy of dismantling. Either way, though, I think in terms of its political viability, I really don't see this as happening.
Very low.
Yeah.
Very low.
Yeah.
Very low.
Yeah.
I mean,
even in this crisis moment, I don't see this as
It's science fictional. If Biden administration had canceled the billions of dollars of housing and mortgage debt that currently exists because of the COVID crisis, it would be fucking shocking.
Yeah.
But it's very low viability right now. Even in local city councils or places that have Democratic socialists elected to office, it's still very, very low because you're dealing with the land barons and the proprietarians.
I do think the thing that gives it any viability or gives it some viability in current political context is if it becomes a bailout for land barons, for landlords. So if it goes directly to landlords and or indirectly to landlords as payments to tenants who then just pass that on directly to their landlords, then if it's in the landlord's interest, then maybe it gets some political viability.
What did you put for effectiveness? So it's very low, but if we were to do it both in a temporary sense and a more permanent sense, it becomes high?
Well, it becomes a more moderate, it has some good degree of effectiveness. If it becomes a bridge to a more, or leverage point to more permanent banning or running back of rents, then I think it has some good effectiveness.
So, I mean, that's the one thing I put it at high, but I mean, if a socialist was doing it with mobilization, it'd be very high because this would be the beginning of a full decommodification. Right.
Yeah.
So it could be very high if not only socialists elected, but the public was demanding and mobilizing on it.
Yeah.
If there was citywide protests and direct action or general strikes, it would be very high. It would be the beginning of escaping capitalism, right?
Yeah.
But generally speaking, I don't know, because it's not changing permanent property relations, if it'd be that effective if it was done by a liberal or conservative.
Yeah, I think these three sorts of strategies, seizing hotels, banning evictions, canceling rent debts, we could see as falling into, and they should.
Variability.
Maybe.
Yeah,
variability, but should into sort of shock doctrine, to borrow Naomi Klein's kind of thinking around these things as the potential kind of leverage points when there's a crisis that should have been opened up due to the COVID pandemic as pathways to decommodification, but so far haven't played out that way. The next one is inclusionary zoning. So these are zoning regulations that mandate that new residential construction projects include some fraction of affordable units. So
Tokenization.
you
Get a little poorhouse. You get a little poorhouse, but we're protecting you. It's, I think, more famously thought of as Mayor de Blasio's horrible policies.
Right.
And so Mayor de Blasio's been kind of the leading edge of liberalism for this seemingly nice idea, which is actually really lame. And it's basically creating what you call affordable or mixed housing,
Right.
or housing that is, in the loosest sense, market rates, which is, of course, insane
Right.
because market rates are not tied to actual income of
Right.
the residents that live in the area. So it's definitely the liberal version of taming.
Yeah.
You're not going to see conservatives ever think about this at all. They don't even know what the term probably means.
Right.
But it's definitely,
Right.
in terms of anti-capitalist strategic logics, it's definitely a taming kind of thing.
Yeah, this is, build your big luxury development, but be sure to have a couple units, some small percentage of apartments in there that are quote unquote
What's so
affordable.
mind-boggling is the housing need, especially with 87% of homes being built are luxury homes.
Yep.
It's not going to do it because
No.
it's not the actual population's need.
No.
It's trinkets thrown at the little peasants, basically.
Yeah. Yeah. So I agree. To be generous, again, to be very generous, maybe there's some degree of taming, but typically not. It's typically not in any way anti-capitalist.
This pisses me off the most. It's because it's liberals acknowledging the problem, but not really admitting what
Right.
really needs to be done.
This is squarely an example of charity and or philanthropy logic.
Yeah,
This
it's
is
a
the
neoliberal
bullshit,
logic, yeah.
kind of like, Bill Gates Foundation will save us kind of bullshit.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think you have to be very generous to say that there's anything anti-capitalist about this. So I think, therefore, this political viability remains pretty high,
Oh, yeah. Yeah,
I think, for both parts of the corporate political parties. However, obviously, its effectiveness remains low or very, very low.
I would put very low because I haven't seen any case where it's doing anything better than what is normally done through
Yeah.
other alternatives. So
No.
I put low or very low.
Yeah. There's some fairly good assessment of this in that People's Policy Project paper we've referred to a few times. The next one is low-income housing tax credits, often abbreviated as LIHTC. And these are tax credit incentive schemes that give developers tax credits for building low-income housing.
Subsidy. Welcome to subsidy land.
Yeah, these are subsidies.
Exactly.
Yeah, subsidy land.
This
These
is
are
like,
incentives.
you work at Walmart, we're going to subsidize you
Yeah.
with these little doodads.
These become effectively subsidies for luxury housing developments.
Yeah. It's a way of removing the visibility of the sins of the private sector.
It's very much like the last one we talked about, the inclusionary zoning, but this is not a zoning measure. It's a
It's
subsidy.
tied to the people themselves, exactly.
Yeah.
It's a kind of a subsidy, not for the development of projects. It's a subsidy attached to the people themselves.
But it results in the same kind of thing. A small percentage of supposedly affordable units, a very small percentage attached to or alongside these bigger luxury developments.
So as an anti-capitalist strategic logic, I also put this down as taming. It's trying to tame the worst, harm reduction. That's why I'm using a synonym to it. It's trying to take out the worst aspects of it.
I would say that's the most generous assessment.
Oh, yeah.
Otherwise, this is not anti-capitalist in any way.
Yeah.
The most generous assessment would be that this is just like money laundering.
This is like
for
encampments
simple
where
pirates.
like it barely registers.
Yeah, barely registers, if even. Mostly, I think this is just a fucking scam.
This is basically a wag the dog. Yeah.
Yeah.
This is totally a wag the dog. It's another example of trying to kick the can down the road because they don't want to actually do power redistribution.
Exactly. So therefore, I think it's very high in terms of viability. That's why it's the thing, right?
Yeah.
That's why it even exists, is because it's politically viable, right? And its effectiveness is virtually nil.
Would conservatives would it be very high if it was conservatives in office? Would you say it was more moderate?
I mean, look, if you took the most libertarian capitalist,
Right libertarian. Mm-hmm.
right libertarianism, it's going to reject anything that is any deviation from I got mine, fuck you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, everything is some communist plot.
To be honest, this is a blank hole for me because I don't know what conservatives' positions are on this in terms of elected officials. I don't know if they talk about it or they'd rather have church organizations deal with it.
I don't know. They just, that most right libertarian edge is just waiting for the rapture.
I'm talking about also the other part of the coalition, evangelical conservatives that are in office. I don't know how they view this. I think they'd be more interested in giving money to church organizations to do this.
I don't think there's anything but rallies for America.
Yeah, I don't think,
I don't think there's anything more about policy or anything else to them except for a rally for America and shoot your guns in the air or some bullshit. I don't fucking know.
I think it's probably just rallies since, that's what they do now. America first, America now, America
first.
red, America blazing.
Everlasting hot dogs.
So effectiveness, very low.
Yeah.
As an anti-strategic logic, it barely registers. It barely registers for me either. It's pathetic.
If there does exist an affordable unit that's part of a scheme like this, then great. But the next one we talk about is housing vouchers, formerly in the U.S. known as Section 8. I think they're currently known as the Housing Choice Voucher Program.
Funded by HUD.
Funded by Housing and Urban Development.
HUD.
It currently helps to subsidize rents for a little over 2 million households, but that's only a small percentage of those who are...
Maybe 20%, maybe about 20% of the population federally.
Yeah.
So I would say it's definitely within the category of anti-capitalist strategic logic as taming.
Mm-hmm.
It's harm reduction. That's the synonym I keep using. And it's identified by federal law, so it's very high. It's not even debatable. It's a permanent part of a fixture of our economy. So it shouldn't be organized as political viability because it's actually law.
Yeah, but it has all kinds of problems because obviously if there's nearly 12 million households that would qualify, but only 2 million
That's
get
why
it.
its effectiveness is really, it's not very low like low-income housing. It is a good amount of money, but it hits so few people. So it does,
so
the people that
ineffective,
qualify, it does help them.
Yeah.
It does help them in a meaningful way. But I put it low as a result of that, both because it actually is meaningful to 20% of the population that applies for it, and the other 80%, there's just no money for them.
Yeah, it's a program as part of a former welfare state, formerly existing welfare state. And there is a book I haven't read yet, but it's on my list, a recent book by Ava Rosen called The Voucher Promise, Section 8 and the Fate of an American Neighborhood. It looks at a neighborhood of Section 8 housing. I think of this as, this is a social safety net, so-called social safety net kind of program. It's akin to food stamps or what's called now SNAP, or unemployment insurance.
Yes.
But it's less accessible than those programs.
It has a revolutionary potential, though, for instance.
Yeah.
And this is where we can get into later, which is you could imagine as part of the Green New Deal for housing that people are given a big chunk of money to actually help invest in their community and create Danish co-housing models, and where this money goes to the construction of homes that's tied to the individual who then get to decide how to use it to create housing for their community. Yeah. So it could be cobbled together.
As it exists, it is problematic in ways that lend to or that exacerbate segregation, that exacerbate discrimination. It's got all kinds of corruption problems. But if it was universalized and expanded, made more generous, you can see it as this seed of a leverage to something more emancipatory.
Yeah, it's part of the Green New Deal. You could imagine, this is like socialism for low. You give the money to people to decide how they want to actually create housing in their local community.
If it was housing vouchers for everyone universally and it paid for everything, then great. Awesome.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's take
but right
that,
now, it's state charity. And it's very much connected to housing projects. So we won't actually build public housing or social housing, but we'll just give you these vouchers.
Yeah.
It's kind of the last remnants of social democracy in the United States.
It's a thing like food stamps and unemployment insurance that has the seeds of emancipation in it potentially, and like universities, right? It's the seeds of emancipation, but it's been totally co-opted and corrupted. So it's therefore something that's highly worth fighting for, but not just as it is. It needs to be totally transformed and expanded. So yes, I think middle of the road in terms of its political viability and effectiveness because of those things.
Well, I put very high because it's just a federal law. I mean, it's actually, no one's fighting against vouchers. It's not contested at all in any meaningful sense.
Yeah.
Because conservatives don't have any solution that would replace that other than just go outside and die.
Yeah, I mean, it's in that way as part of the welfare state set of programs. It's like Social
Fragments
Security.
And skeletons, And notice this variability because I put it down as low, but it could be very high if it's working as a bridge point or it's universalized. Yeah.
Okay, the next one we'll talk about is rent control. So rent control varies from location to location, city and state and so forth, but rent controls are effectively caps on the percentage of annual rent increase. There's different types of rent control. There's the type that's a harder rent control that is regardless of the tenant, but the more common type is a weak kind of rent control that expires when anybody moves. It's tied to a tenancy. So if you move, then the landlord can increase the rent.
And we had this in California. This is how powerful private land developers are, the proprietarians and land barons, is we actually had a ballot proposition in California. I think it's 2018. It was called Proposition 10, and it would have allowed cities the right to create rent control.
Well, then again,
it's not to create rent control. It's allow cities in the state of California to actually do rent control if they choose to do so.
Yeah.
That tells you how powerful these land barons are. It was a ballot proposition just to allow the thought of doing it.
Well, again, the latest version of that proposition was Proposition 21, just this last year in 2020, just to allow for localities to create rent control measures. It wasn't itself creating rent control. It was just make it possible for cities and counties to create
And for Proposition 10 in California, it was like 20% versus 80% in funding. So of the 100% of funding that was going in, 80% was all, supporting the land barons, and 20% was people trying to just support rent control. And those are largely nonprofit sectors and individuals supporting it. Democratic Social America, the California statewide chapters, were actually canvassing and phone banking on that ballot proposition. That was kind of the first statewide measure that DSA members were involved with. So once again, I think, it's definitely something that would be effective, definitely effective.
Yeah.
But in terms of as a strategic logic, what did you put it down as?
Well, I think this can be a logic of dismantling. Again, this is a variable thing because it depends on what type and to what degree we're talking about rent control. I think if you imagine or we look at rent control measures that are hard caps, then it's definitely a necessary approach. And I think potentially
I put it down as resisting.
Yeah.
I mean, it has a bridgeway. It could be part of a menu item of dismantling, but it'd have to be in concert with other things.
Exactly.
So if it's connected to other things, it could be part of the tapestry towards dismantleization. But I think I put it down as resisting for the most part, for what we're currently seeing.
Yeah, in terms of things we've discussed thus far, this is super important. It's rare because typically, like in California, I lived 12 years in LA in a rent-controlled apartment. And in that context, the rent control only applied to housing units over a certain age. That's what at least in LA, that's what they were. I think it's 30 or 40 years old. Basically, imagine that it applies to units that the original cost or the original debt for the construction have already been paid off, whether it's a big developer group or an individual landlord. The mortgages, all that is gone. It's just pure profit from then on. So those are the units that are under rent control. And where I live currently in British Columbia, the province here has a sort of form of rent control that's province-wide. That is, the lawmakers for the province determine a limit. It's, again, just a weak kind of rent control, but it's a limit on annual increases. But again, if this can be measures that are universalized and given hard caps, then it becomes much more effective. And because it's so contested, I think this is something that, even though rent control measures do exist in different areas, it's still, as we talked about with these proposition measures in California that failed, this is very low. So preserving and expanding rent control has been a real struggle.
Oh my God, absolutely. Because you're controlling the rate of profit for land developers and
private land barons.
Exactly. And so it's very low. This is incredibly contested. It's violently contested.
Yeah. But I think it does have pretty high effectiveness in terms of
I put high for
addressing.
this. Yeah. I put high. It's one of the things that would be part of a greater, larger movement, and it becomes the baseline for anything that's dismantling or escaping.
Exactly. Yes. This is a must-have in our ecology of tactics.
It should always come up in conversation if you're talking about housing.
It should always,
Because if you're renting a house like me, like when I was renting a house in Riverside before I bought this townhome that I'm in, condo, whatever they want to call this absurd thing, it's up to the land baron's kindness as to what they're going to raise it as. Like some people, they don't raise it much. Some people raise it little. It's like, man, we need something that's more effective moral as a compass. And rent control is one of those things that creates a common denominator for rights.
Yeah. In California, in places that qualified, like the apartment I lived in, the cap was 3% increase a year. And that's the limit that is at the discretion of the land baron to increase the rent. The landlord that I rented from lived right on the property. So he didn't even increase it every year. It was only every other year he increased it. And so over 12 years, my rent only increased like a couple $100. So that's what rent control can do.
Yeah.
Okay, so we will move on now to what is probably going to be one of the bigger topics here, or the bigger subjects in terms of strategies to address housing problem. And this is the sphere of social and or public, or sometimes referred to as municipal housing.
So if I get this right, public housing is
social
what we typically call it in the United States, and in Europe they call it social housing, right?
Except for in the UK and Britain, they call it usually council housing. That's just as the local councils. But yeah, so this is publicly owned, state-owned, owned by the government housing.
The most famous example of that was the fire that occurred at a council house.
Oh, just a couple of years ago. You mean Grenfell Tower?
Yes. The Grenfell Tower is an example of council housing there. And it spoke to the harshness of neoliberalism on what was really a shining example of social democratic policies in Britain.
Yeah. Social and or public housing, there's a lot of discourse about it these days in the socialist left. But one touchstone here to look at is that we've already mentioned the 2018 paper by Saoirse Gowan and Ryan Cooper, written for the People's Policy Project, called Social Housing in the United States, which was part of what established what seems to be a growing socialist left consensus around social housing, which is a plan to build 10 million mixed income publicly owned homes over the next decade. So this seems to have become the sort of slogan that there's getting some gravity around, which is 10 million homes in 10 years. Some of these, there are plans that cast this as a Green New Deal for housing. Daniel Cohen, who is one of the co-authors of A Planet to Win, is part of a group that's advancing this kind of thing and has a piece actually in the Jacobin Spring 2019 issue about a Green New Deal for housing that again calls for 10 million zero-carbon homes in the next 10 years.
And remarkably similar to Bernie Sanders' policies with the GND when he was running in the primary for the Democratic Party.
Yes.
He also had a strong, robust vision of about, I think, $2.5 trillion used for housing.
Yeah. Part of Bernie's 2020 campaign platform was Housing for All, which included $2.5 trillion to build 10 million affordable housing units in the next decade.
And that is amazing because, the money that Biden's throwing around, small potatoes to what was being envisioned in the Bernie campaign.
And Ilhan Omar introduced an act in 2019 into Congress, the Homes for All Act, which calls for $1 trillion to construct 12 million homes over the next decade.
These haven't happened not just because of the fear of taxation, but also because of the people wanting to control the current real estate prices.
Yeah.
Because if you were to actually have these many homes being built, housing would be much more affordable and the balloon would be popped in terms of what land barons are able to profit from.
Yeah. And there's a good video. I think we may have even included it in our last set of show notes too, because it came up, was this Gravel Institute video, How Socialists Solve the Housing Crisis, which, like much of the discourse here in this space, celebrates so-called Red Vienna and all of the social housing and the long now stable social housing programs in Vienna.
At the height of its powers in Red Vienna, it was just shocked me. I just almost shit my pants. People that were living in Red Vienna, right? it was 4% of your income was housing. 4% of your income.
Yeah.
I don't think if you own a house in the United States, you pay less than 4%, even if you own the house.
Yeah. So there are all kinds of variations on this theme and this scheme. And again, this is existing, provable. There are examples everywhere. This is at the heart of social democratic solutions to housing, is publicly owned housing. So all over the world, there are different examples of greater degrees of success in social housing. Unfortunately, and we talked about this every time we talk about housing, this has been largely a failure in the United States. Public housing projects have long been attacked and intentionally.
Because they're connected to blight and because they only locate housing as a project for the poor. And I think whereas Red Vienna didn't view housing as a project for the poor exclusively, but wanted to universalize it as a project.
Right.
I mean, I think this is, as an anti-capitalist strategic logic, I think this is very much dismantling, but not escaping. I think it still exists from the state.
Yes.
When I'm thinking of socialism, I'm thinking of the disappearance or the fragmentation of the state. So I definitely think it's dismantling. And because it's been so hard to pull off, even when it was done in the most robust periods of the 1950s and 60s, it was largely for poor people. And so right now, it's a very low viability. I'll talk about this later. I think community land trusts have a much higher viability because of its role in local community organizing. And the fear of the big government is such it makes it very hard to do. Now, if effectiveness, it's very high if it's done. If it's done right, if it's integrated housing, not just poor people, it's very effective.
in the sort of general look at social housing, public housing, that's a key factor, is whether or not it's aimed at a universal population or that it's means tested to certain income levels.
And you see this with CLTs. The CLTs that are the most dynamic and effective are the ones that do integrated housing, not inclusionary housing, that bullshit where it's a market aspect, but you're actually erasing the segregation on racial, gendered, income-based housing. You desegregate on race, gender, and class housing. And if you're doing it for social housing or public housing, it's very effective. If you're doing it for CLTs, the most powerful and effective CLTs are ones that do that.
So Saoirse Gowan and Ryan Cooper say that how can we solve the housing crisis? Simple. Have the government build more housing. So I think social housing or public housing programs or strategies currently exist as sort of an analog to Medicare for all, but in the housing policy politics space. So think of this as the sort of Medicare for all of housing policy. And I think this is the sort of happy middle ground between what's politically imaginable within the current Overton window and what has great degree of effectiveness if it's done right. So I think there are many different ways that this can happen.
But it requires socialists starting to really exert power and be more than one person on a city council and more than 10 congressmen in Congress.
And many schemes for social housing and proposals for social housing do include community land trusts as part of that. So these aren't necessarily separate. They overlap to a great degree. It just depends on what kind of mechanisms and bureaucracies are used to build, manage, and maintain and control all the systems around this. But if it's universal, if it's not just means tested and segregated for certain populations or demographics, this can be highly emancipatory. This can be a real effective solution space, and I think this is why there's so much energy around it. But
and it creates conditions of trust in your society. I'm taking care of you, you're taking care of me, and we can create beautiful structures. I'll link an article in Jacobin about some of the beautiful revivals of social housing in Spain where they're architecturally gorgeous, and you want them to be near your residence because you can have community access spaces that are part and parcel of bringing in individuals at residential homes and buying them into this idea of having social housing. If it's beautiful and improves their value in their private homes, you can actually have them built.
And I think this is exactly what we want and need. But it's just a matter of whether or not this becomes a state socialist kind of strategy or a doorway to full emancipation, full freedom, meaning fully decommodified. So I think this actually provides a kind of baseline for what we're going to talk about in the rest of the list.
And so I think it's very similar to rent control, where this is like we're starting to get really active and exciting. It's a must-have. It should be on the portfolio for any socialist or anyone that cares about the right to housing. Forget if you're a socialist, but just the right to housing if you care about it.
Just if you think housing has use value.
Exactly. And so the most exciting ideas, not surprisingly, have very low political viability because of money in politics. So basically, rent control and this are examples of very low political viability. But it doesn't mean we shouldn't fight for it. We should be very much on the front of the burner.
I think as it exists, this has very low political viability. This is why it's a space of struggle now for
That's why it's exciting.
Exactly. Right? And it's exciting, but also has very
the
high
window.
Very high effectiveness if it can be done. But also I think that in a world turned right side up, this would be a very centrist kind of position. This exemplifies what should be the center.
It is the center in Red Vienna. So in Austria where it's at, it is the center. But it doesn't exert itself outside of the city. So that's the problem. And so if you go outside of Vienna, it's been far less successful being adopted outside of Vienna itself as a city. So the political viability should be very high. Effectiveness should be very high, and it should be very popular.
It should be default, it should be default.
I think once again, if you get 90% of homes like this, it becomes universal.
If private ownership is abolished, then what do we have replace it? Do we have public ownership? So anyways, this will play into the rest of our schemes and solutions, I think. So the next one we'll talk about is community land trusts.
Woo!
This is
that's my wheelhouse.
This is your wheelhouse. This is what you spend time
Matt
and
3.0
on.
right here. tasty bacon.
Matt 3.0. But basically, for those who aren't familiar yet, it's land in the trust of a community organization. Typically, as these exist, are through nonprofit organizations. So these are registered nonprofits, typically, that are trusts for the land. So basically, it's you take the land that housing is built on and put it into a trust. So it's held by the community instead of privately. And that helps to create a limit on speculative pricing of the housing that's built on it. And depending on the measures of that nonprofit organization, there can be weaker or stronger limits on profit seeking.
Yeah. Or profit sharing.
Or profit sharing from the housing.
This is what I've said to people when I try to describe it, because it's a very new idea for people that are politically disconnected or disenchanted.
Yes.
It's Medicare for all for housing. If it's done and it done well, and I think the only way it works is if it does partial decommodification. It takes out and prevents the worst aspects of speculation.
I would say that it's more accurate to equate this with worker-owned co-ops. So I think social housing is sort of the Medicare for all for housing.
Really? Yeah.
I think CLTs are like the worker-owned co-ops. So it's like a co-op for housing, like a worker-owned co-op.
Yeah, well, I think...
Either way, it's in that kind of space.
Here's why I think it's partial decommodification is it's not just the workers or the people that are in it, it's the community itself. It moves back to indigenous relationships to land.
Yeah.
So the house is the private aspect, and the land is the commons aspect.
Yes.
So if you look at the Burlington Community Land Trust, what is now known as the Champlain Housing Trust, you can do whatever you want in the house. You have sovereignty in the house.
Right.
But the land is actually decommodified, which means that private speculators can't attack it. If you sell the house has to be sold back
to the trust
with first choice to the CLT.
Yep. Yeah.
And when the house prices go up, because it exists within parallel structure to the market, that's why I say it's escaping capitalism, because it exists in parallel but outside of the market.
Right.
Its prices are set to the market, but because it's owned by the CLT, it's indigenous. It's a recommoning of the land. And so you can give grants to people buying the home who would never be able to afford it because the CLT would have a portfolio to afford that.
Yeah.
And so it's a partial decommodification.
I think like the broader scheme of social housing, this is, like you say, a partial decommodification. It's in a unique kind of way because, like you described, it's separating the commodification of the land from the commodification of the building so that isn't all one speculative object. But it's basically an alternative model of ownership that is a hybridized model of ownership where there's individual ownership of housing or housing unit on top of a cooperatively owned land.
And it puts up walls on private speculation. So all of these billionaires that are pumping insane amounts of money into major cities all over the world, Vancouver, like you had an article on LinkedIn, where people are going to buy a parking space for $48,000 and consider it a deal. Fucking parking space, $48,000. And so it does the thing which it prevents the market from actually coming in and creating a new enclosure on the land. Yeah. It's basically a disenclosure movement.
Yeah. And it is an existing kind of paradigm. There are apparently now more than 230 CLTs across the United States. There's around 150 in the UK, and there are many, many other places. So I don't know how many in total. It's a small number, but it's an existing number. And there are some good examples like the Burlington one you've talked about. But again, it's a scheme that is, as they exist now, largely tied to nonprofit organizations. So like any nonprofit, there are potential pitfalls. There are ways that this can go south or go sour.
In terms of the housing conversations that are happening, this is the hottest thing right now.
Yeah.
I mean, liberals are starting to get interested in this, which is a real big breakdown on liberal ideology, because all of the reformist logics of temporary housing, housing first, encampments, they've been criticized so much for their lack of effectiveness that the socialists have both put this on the Twitter conversation, and also people are actually creating them all over the place.
Yeah.
And so this political viability is actually the one to change the most. I put this as moderate because again and again, when people talk about and know it's CLTs, and I think it's because of the communication wing of the left is doing a good job on this policy, it's getting a lot of broad-based, non-ideological support. Yeah. People that are maybe apathetic or they like it. And I think what's different from this, from social housing, is it's not the big bad government taking over.
Yes.
It's your local nonprofit, it's your community, it's your neighbors. It has a kind of almost a non-ideological component to it, where it feels like we're just doing something nice. It's involving the community. It doesn't have to be left or right. And so this is having a moment. And we're seeing this because this is the new trend. So this is the most exciting part. And so I would say this is the thing that's changed the most in terms of political viability. Maybe 5 years ago, this wouldn't even be a moderate political viability, but I think it's moved into moderate.
And I see community land trusts as in the space of addressing the housing problem as a doorway. This is the first on this list, I think, that's a real doorway to decommodification.
Yeah, it's halfway in, halfway out. It's that medium step. It's that transition step.
Yes.
And I think what's important of this is, I was talking to Jeff Green, who, once again, I mentioned in prior podcasts, I'm the co-founder and secretary of the Inland Equity Community Land Trust for the Inland Empire.
Yep.
And my colleague and comrade, Jeff, has talked about this as, in some sense, a prefigurative kind of politics.
Yes. Yep.
So in the Occupy Wall Street, Occupy Riverside, where I was involved with, we had a version of our own towns inside of that Occupy site.
Yep.
And so this is an attempt to do prefigurative politics, to reimagine what the state won't do.
Yes.
And cities aren't going to do this because why? Their funders are private land developers. So they're never going to develop their own citywide CLT. This is the stuff that your city should be doing.
Right. We'll talk about that.
But they won't because they're own. Exactly. So this is something that is prefigurative because we're like, we're so good at this that maybe the city ought to just take this over and do it itself.
Yeah. This straddles both the dismantling and escaping kind of logics. This is part of why I think there's like you described, there's a potential appeal and potential apolitical appeal to a larger demographic, because it appeals to those who just want to live in a cabin in the woods or, just escape the whole mess, because this sort of appeals, I think, to a libertarian kind of ethos in a way, because it's not an embrace of the state the way that social housing or public housing is as a mechanism to provide this need. But I do think it's still pretty low in terms of viability. But for all the reasons you said, I think...
I put it moderate, actually, yeah.
Yeah, I think it has some moderate... Yeah.
It's moved, right? I mean, I think of the things we've talked about, this is the one that's moved.
Yes, exactly. I agree.
And so that's why I'm involved with it, because it's the one that has political leverage potential.
It's a crack that Matt can fit in.
One of the few. Yes. My large body can find a crack to put myself in. Yeah. And so definitely, I would say very high effectiveness when it's done right. Agreed. Very much like social housing. So we can think of them as part and parcel of, they're basically could be twins.
Exactly. Right. Under the social housing could be community land trusts. That combination prefigures one of the solution spaces we'll get to in a few here down the list. So the next one I want to talk about and bring into this conversation is a set of solutions that aren't typically
thought of as aligned with or about housing, but I think we should see them as addressing the housing problem, and that would be universal basic income and or, preferably, and the jobs guarantee. So universal basic income is something like, if you imagine the child tax credit that folks just started to get. I did.
Which is basically an advance, but it's more, so it's not really just an advance on your typical tax credit. But
it's an extra supplement because you're still getting the child tax credit of $3,000 or $3,600 depending on your kid's age. But now it's an additional sum.
Right. Or if we think back to the 3 times in the states that there was what did they call them? Stimulus checks, right? If those became...
2,000, 1,400, who knows?
Now it's a long ago history, but if we remember back just to a year ago, this is what the Bernie sphere was all about, was the $2,000 a month. $2,000 a month, make it permanent.
Yeah, that's a tragedy of COVID. We didn't get Medicare for all, and we didn't get an experiment in UBI.
Yeah.
Those are 2 things where there was political leverage that could have been applied and didn't happen. And we're past that point.
Yeah. Now, there has been and there continue to be experiments, small-scale experiments in UBI, especially
and California is doing one right now with a UBI for pregnant mothers and also for folks that are moving out of the foster status. That's being implemented. I know Stockton, California had a program they did. So it's being played with.
The other side of that is a jobs guarantee. This is a central part of a Green New Deal movement energy is, for instance, like the idea of a civilian climate corps, giving young people jobs to help repair the biosphere or to do reparative work to install solar in homes and those sorts of things. All this sort of integrates together.
The UBI component feels very much like Section 8 housing. So we're talking about these vouchers. So we could think of this as a more robust version of voucher system. And once again, the cool thing with UBI is there's no paperwork.
Yeah.
Everybody in, nobody out.
Yeah.
There's no administrative layer. And this is where there's obvious right libertarian support for UBI. Of course, they would like to cancel any social democratic funding.
Right.
The left should say, no, we want this and robust social housing, social funding for social democracy.
Yeah.
And that lends itself towards democratic socialism. But definitely UBI would be a way of taking the voucher idea and using it in a much more fair, universal gesture.
Yeah. It's come up a lot in our conversations. We talk a lot about UBI, so I won't bog us down with getting into the weeds further. But in thinking of UBI and a jobs guarantee in the context of the housing problems, see it as an indirect approach, but an economic approach that goes towards addressing the housing problem because it helps to ensure that people can better afford housing. I think it would be really good if it's paired with universal rent control, which was part of Bernie Sanders' platform of Housing for All, was to create a universal or federal rent control. But why would we consider this as part of the housing? Well, why do we want either a minimum wage or a livable wage or jobs guarantee or UBI? Well, to cover the goddamn motherfucking cost of living, right? To cover the goddamn motherfucking cost of housing.
Yeah.
That's why we
and you could see how they could interact. So the good thing with the Jobs Guarantee Act is we can create parallel market for the common good.
Right.
And so you could have someone that's living in a CLT who actually
has a guaranteed job to create the house, build the house.
Well, exactly. So you have a worker cooperative construction company where they get the money to actually create their own cooperative construction company using rammed earth or adobe structures, basically sustainable housing and environmental as such. And the Jobs Guarantee does that. So it actually furthers the trajectory of CLTs in social housing.
Right. We'll spend more time in future conversations about how these all kind of interlock and why the Golden Square is so important as a conception to think about all these things, because what is the work we do? Well, the work we could do is the construction of the need in the first place and then the maintenance and care of that social need.
So we have those two together. What would you say? Would you, in terms of anti-capitalist strategic logics, where does this sit at? Because you're putting them as a package. So one might be in one and one might be in the other.
Either a universal basic income and or jobs guarantee is a way to make sure that people have the adequate numbers in their accounts to cover the costs of housing.
So it would be dismantling? What did you put down? I put down dismantling.
I think dismantling. Yeah, I think dismantling. This would fall into dismantling as the sort of logic. It's creating an alternative. Therefore, I think it's viability, as we've seen, because these are not new demands. Again, these go back to the 60s and
Civil rights movement. And going back to the freedom budget for all Americans from the Philip Randolph Institute, we've talked about quite extensively in previous episodes. UBI was part of the conversation.
Yeah, a guaranteed income.
I think Nixon almost passed it. There was a point where it was being thought of,
Yeah. I mean, we've talked about UBI a lot, and the history goes back much further than that, but
this is where I disembark, though. I'd say UBI is low and Jobs Guarantee Act is very low. And when it comes to like effectiveness, they're both very high.
Yeah.
But I think depending on which one you're talking about, UBI seems to be the one that's pushing ahead.
I mean, I don't know. It's hard to say, I guess.
I can't think of anyone outside of the squad or Bernie Sanders that's advocating for Jobs Guarantee Act. But I can see UBI having a wider appeal. So right libertarians don't support Jobs Guarantee Act, but they do support UBI.
That's weird.
That's why I'd say it's a little bit stronger.
Yeah,
I know.
Weird.
It's right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Well, because there's a problem with it, because the market is God and you're creating a parallel market.
Right. I mean, either way, neither of them seem very viable as large-scale programs.
My discrepancy, I would say that UBI is currently being done in certain places, so I'd say it's happening.
Right.
Whereas Jobs Guarantee is not happening.
And I mean, that's what the stimulus checks, quote-unquote stimulus checks were anyways. And that's what the wealthy already have built into themselves. That's what wealth is.
Well, land barons have. Passive income.
Is passive income. So that does it for
access and affordability, part 1 and part 2.
Yeah, part 1 and part 2, access and affordability. And now we move into approaches, schemes, solution spaces that are really decommodification, that are actual decommodification. We've gone through the doorway, and now we're actually going to talk about schemes for decommodification. So the first one is the cancellation of rent and mortgages. What we talked about previously was the canceling the unpaid back rent. but canceling all housing payments. So rent,
Permanent.
mortgages permanently. I just want to, again, just draw attention to the reality here. In 2019, in the U.S., renters paid $500 billion, $512 billion in rent. And the U.S. military spending far outpaces that by double at least. Is $934 billion.
Read those numbers back just for our listeners. It's a shocking difference.
$512 billion paid by U.S. renters in rent in 2019, and the U.S. military spending is $934 billion.
Half of the military budget could already be used for this. Right. Half of it.
So,
fuck this.
In reality, right, in terms of can we afford it, the U.S. federal government, if it cared more about housing people than murdering them, could pay everybody's rent.
Woo,
right.
Man.
So that's the reality.
Gothic.
And obviously that's in terms of political viability, that's sort of unimaginable.
If it was a piece of clothing, what would it look like? Daggers and spears, my man.
But anyway, the idea is the full and permanent cancellation of rent and mortgage payments. Now, on the one hand, that seems so fantastical as we think about how would that even work. But what I want to sketch out very briefly is a sort of scheme that I've been thinking about as a potential method to abolish rent and to abolish mortgages, to actually do the cancellation of rent and mortgages. And this would be to create a scheme in which tenants pay property tax instead of rent or mortgage.
Yeah, so you're right. There's three things. There's the rent, there's the mortgages, and property taxes, which is part of this assemblage of features. Now, when you're paying rent, the land baron's paying the property taxes.
Right.
But if you get rid of the mortgage, you get rid of the rent, you're left with property taxes, a third viable option for a sustainable funding mechanism.
Right. So we talked about this little thought room in the last one. You know, what happens to your house or your apartment if you don't pay the mortgage or the rent? Well, nothing, right? It exists. It's already there. So in terms of costs that go into housing, right, there's the initial investment costs for the construction. So there's a debt load there to pay for the land and pay for the construction materials and the labor to build the thing. And then beyond that, there's the paying down of that debt, because usually that's financed through all kinds of debt mechanisms, whether that's a privately owned home or a conglomeration or a corporation developer. And then there's property taxes to a local city or county municipality, and the maintenance upkeep, the care costs over time. Most of what a landlord or land baron has to cover in terms of overhead is just property taxes and the maintenance and upkeep, even if they do maintenance and upkeep. You know, a lot of land barons just forego doing their right responsibility for that. So as a scheme for paying for housing, why not have tenants just pay, instead of rent and mortgage, just pay the property tax?
And once again, it can be a shared, like UBI, it can be a flat amount throughout the city.
Yeah.
This is where we get to the Utopian Sphere in some senses, where it's a flat amount that everybody pays that's equally invested in this. It's a kind of a tithing for the commune.
So if you imagine wherever you currently live, if you live in an apartment or a home, whether you pay it because you're a homeowner or a land baron or a landlord pays it because they own the property, there's property tax. And that varies. In the U.S., it ranges from around $570 a year in Alabama to somewhere in the vicinity of $8,000 a year in New Jersey. But typically, averaged out in the U.S., homeowners pay around $2,300 in property taxes for the year. Now, that's less than I pay for a month in rent. So imagine if your whole payment for housing for the year was basically 1 month's rent. That's what it would mean to pay the property tax.
That's getting back to that Red Vienna conception of where it's just like 4% of your income. It's no longer the reason why you have income. It's like housing's just like an afterthought.
Right.
I mean, it's like paying a parking ticket. That's how small it will seem in annual income terms.
Under this type of arrangement, you would, as a tenant, whether it's a single family home or apartment, whatever, right? You would pay the city or the county, the district, whatever the sort of local government arrangement is, the commune, the city CLT, for your housing instead of a landlord, instead of a bank.
It makes you an equal participant in your community, right? It totally changes the structural powers at B. So it creates a horizontal relationship.
The notion is that it would give everybody, quote unquote, equity in the home ownership class.
Well, it stops being a class altogether, right? It just becomes like this shared agreement of egalitarian society.
Yeah. I think that the most important thing here, this whole conception and imagining this, is recasting housing as a public good. So instead of paying a private institution or private individual for this housing debt burden, like you do for owning a home or I do for renting an apartment, we instead pay the community. We pay basically ourselves, if it's a real direct democracy. which that funding then, as property taxes do, goes to help fund the entire community and the services of the community.
You see this as part of achieving the golden square?
Yes.
Or is this part of the utopian sphere?
No, I see this as achieving the golden square.
So the things when we talk about decommodification requires not the complete destruction of markets, because one of them does. This is the abolition of private property. That seems like more of like the utopian sphere. But for cancel rent and mortgages, definitely escaping capitalism. It's very low political viability and it's very high effectiveness. Yeah. Now, in this section on decommodification, not surprising, we're going to say it's all super ass motherfucking effective. Like all of these things.
So all of these, and we could basically just say now that in terms of political viability for these four things we're going to talk about in this decommodification list, the viability is like just virtually nil because we just don't have
not even on the chart.
Yeah.
It's all very low political viability, but it's not if there's left socialist hegemony in the United States.
Yeah. Yeah.
If we have majoritarian values for socialism, then this is very viable and very effective.
Yeah. If you allow me, I just want to just very briefly sketch out a few more details of this conception of paying property tax instead of rent. So it would mean not just property tax, there would also be utilities, maintenance and repair costs, but those could be collectivized and should be at a fixed or capped rates that are managed through local publicly owned municipal service providers. So
systems of deliberation.
Not just our local utilities and power, but also maintenance and upkeep. Those could all be collective, publicly owned and locked in at affordable rates. Obviously, this would require expropriating rental properties and private homes from private ownership and putting that property in the hands of the community and or city. This could happen piecemeal. This could happen a little bit at a time. Same way CLTs and or social housing could happen. And it actually should happen in combination with those things. This actually could be the scheme that social housing uses to pay.
And it requires a renaissance in social relations. Now, if these things are adopted, it becomes a revolution in social relations. Right. So we go from a renaissance of the existing social relations, things we had in the past that we can recreate, versus a revolution of post-scarcity housing.
Yeah. This would require utilizing, as in any public housing schema would, existing publicly owned lands. In places where you need to expropriate, you could use eminent domain or other purchasing schemes to expropriate those properties from private ownership. But I think this sort of idea goes hand in hand with a social housing idea and makes a social housing program an actual decommodification program.
Absolutely.
And not just tied to a state socialist market, but actually taking them out of the market. And that's what we really want to do. And last thing I'll say is that if you paired this kind of schema along with a universal basic income and a jobs guarantee and universal healthcare and universal college, you would effectively have created a system where you contained the cost of living. Right? So a universal basic income, guaranteed wage.
Excellent point.
Guaranteed healthcare, guaranteed education, and you just pay this guaranteed low cost for housing. You basically have contained the cost of living, all of it, or most of it anyways. It's not the full abolition of the cost of living, but it's basically fully containing the cost of living so it becomes negligible.
It's basically the baseline rubric for the Golden Square is a containment of cost of living.
Yes. Yeah.
The most far-reaching of these four categories, I think, is the abolition of private property. That's where we really get into the utopian sphere.
Yeah, so we'll get into them. So then we have three more here we're going to get through. The next one then would be schemes to decommodify the land. So you already talked about how in the paradigm of CLTs, part of what the CLT does and is for is to decommodify the land or otherwise put the land into communal ownership. But this would be beyond that. Decommodifying the land would require thinking about having actual cities, municipalities become themselves CLTs. Become themselves communal trusts for land.
Confederations of anarchist communes, right? So where the confederation of a democratic confederalism, or when you want to talk municipal communalism, where the CLTs are now much bigger than just some side project by a couple friends, but they're actually envisioned as part and parcel of a kind of confederation of cooperative organizing.
Conventional CLTs, like the one you're working to establish and the ones that have been established, are typically low numbers of folks, right? We're talking about tens, hundreds, maybe thousands. But if we're talking about decommodifying the land altogether, we're talking about full cities, towns, cities becoming the communal owners of the land.
The bridge point for that is this my idea of doing reverse mortgages for private property. So this is like my idea of how we could take what is currently private and pull it into the CLT, which is if you're elderly and you're older and you lack income, you could agree to get a payment as long as you're alive from the CLT to fold it into the CLT.
Yes.
And so when you die or you retire, this formerly private property is now part of the CLT.
Yeah.
It's a decolonization of property.
Yes.
Because the birthplace of capitalism is colonization. To decolonize it would be to create reverse mortgages to put it back in the commons again.
Yeah, that sounds a lot like what I heard Carla Bergman and Nick Montgomery, who co-wrote the book Joyful Militancy, which is on our list to talk about in a future episode, a scheme that they're working on, which they called solidarity housing, which is basically what you just described, which is to have boomers or older folks who are retiring or in position to sell homes that are already paid off, to sell them to community land trusts or other nonprofit organizations to decommodify that property and put it into a communal ownership. So that seems sort of in line with that.
And some people are doing this as part of their will.
Yep.
So some people are actually giving, when they die, they're going to give their home to a CLT because they like the idea of it going back to the community and creating affordability. And their kids are already wealthy and they're like, fuck this shit. And that's one way of doing that.
All you boomers who sold us out and taught us that it was the end of the world and we couldn't do anything, you better fucking do this. You better fucking do this.
Exactly. You're sitting on $35 trillion of assets.
You better
Time to
fucking
give
do this.
up.
Yeah. So decommodifying the land, I think for me, thinking of cities or municipalities becoming community land trusts is a good way to think about this. And
definitely escaping capitalism as an anti-capitalist strategic logic.
Again, I think this would necessarily go hand in hand and benefit from social housing.
Yeah.
So this is also, you can see as something that would be a key component of any social housing program schema, would be as part of this, we necessarily need to bring that land that's used for social housing into decommodified status and co-responsibility of the local municipality or the city. And so this decommodification of land in this way is not necessarily the end of private property, because like you described how CLTs work in conception is land is decommodified, but the housing isn't. It's a hybrid model, but it does remove the land itself from the market, which is hugely important.
To avoid speculators and to block them from your community because they are harm violators.
But I think there is a prerequisite to consider this as a viable thing, which would be for actual democracy to exist. Cities already own lots of land, but we don't consider it as public or under our care, but we need to, and we don't because we don't live in a democracy. We don't have say over what happens with these things. So I think this is part of imagining decommodification and democratization sort of coming to head in decommodification of the land is one realization of that. And so, yes, this is pushing from dismantling capitalism into escaping and smashing. Like, this is totally escaping. I think these final three that we're talking about, this one and the next two, I would consider as really only viable in a post-capitalist order. These are really post-capitalism. We're talking about now.
Yeah, I mean, this is where the left has hegemony.
Yes.
And where the left is powerful. It's the new common sense, where socialism is the new common sense.
Yeah, I think the last thing we talked about, the cancellation of rent and mortgages, sort of like a final step or a final
step out of
threshold to cross to get into post-capitalism. And now we're talking about actual post-capitalist reality. And so the next one we'll talk about is the abolition of private property.
This is where I would say definitely escaping, very low political viability, of course, massively effective because this is either launching us into the utopian sphere or as part of what would be in the utopian sphere. That goes beyond the golden square.
It would be hard to describe this in a concrete, specific kind of way like other things that we've talked about in this list, because this is such a broad thing that there's lots of dominoes that need to fall before this even becomes a potential at all. But this would be the total end of private ownership of either land or the housing on the land.
This is like the end of human neurosis.
This gets us back into potential relationships of usufruct, of common ownership to things, which is used to describe the right to use things, but not to destroy them. Part of the basis of the logic of private property is that the private property owner has the right to destroy that thing, but usufruct says that people have the right to use things, but not to destroy them because they're held in common. This would really be where we would arrive at the total abolition of landlords. Land barons no longer can exist.
Absolutely.
At this point. So therefore, again, like we've said, viability is almost nil in our current context, but this is the most effective kind of address to the housing problem. The final note here on the decommodification section here is free, zero carbon, safe, comfortable homes for all, guaranteed for your entire life from cradle to grave. For me, that's the realization of the golden square.
And it's something we've said on a very early podcast when we started the show, that we talked about education from cradle to grave. And every node on the golden square is a cradle to grave conception.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Because if it's a right, it never leaves you as long as you exist.
Right. You need it always. So this is, I think, not only a goal, but should be an organizing principle.
It's an outcome.
So
as
I
well.
think this is, it's an outcome potentially at the end of this long, winding story of housing decommodification. But I think it's also the guiding light. It is the guiding principle. It is the thing that we should always have in view, because this is the horizon we're aiming for. So if we don't keep it illuminated at all times, clearly articulated that that's where we're heading, then we won't get there. So I think it's important, even though this is more an outcome potentially than an actual scheme, it's important to keep it clearly articulated, because access and affordability, those two previous sections, those should be non-fucking issues. There should be no fucking problem around access to housing. There should be no fucking problem around affordability of housing. These things are human motherfucking rights.
Absolutely.
That means that you should fucking have them. It's zero cost. They should not be part of any fucking market.
Absolutely.
And we could be there, right? As we've started out, the reality is we could be there already if it weren't for all of these bad ideas in the way. Most of all of this list is about clearing out bad ideas so that we can get to this point.
And creating in that new common sense that then builds onto bigger, more aspirational things. And with the comfort that's created from winning power, it becomes an accelerator for new ideas.
We really want to be in a set of circumstances, not where we're under crisis mode of addressing all of the harms of the marketplace and of the climate catastrophe. We really want to get to a place where we're working on the problems of making all of our housing lower carbon impact and higher quality. This is a kind of dumb problem. Give everybody a house. We have the means to do this. We have the technology to do this. We have the know-how to do this. We should be working on how to make that better.
It's not a resource problem. It's a design problem, right?
Right.
The design utopia requires a new type of schema that makes sense and that actually meets real human need and aspirations.
Now, for me, in my conception, this goal, free, zero carbon, safe, comfortable homes for all, guaranteed from cradle to grave, is the realization of the objective of the golden square. But it is the necessary baseline to get us toward the utopian horizon. So I don't think this is utopian, even though it might sound like that relatively to our current circumstances. For me, the utopian space for housing is when we start to talk about luxury for all. The utopian sphere would include free ecological, meaning giving back to the biosphere, not just less carbon impact, but giving back to the biosphere, feeding the planet, being like trees, right? Making life more possible. So free, ecological, safe, luxurious, not just comfortable, but luxurious homes for all, guaranteed for life.
And that's what's so amazing, because if you just imagine this all over the world, the planet, among all the beings on this planet, just feels like desperate utopia. It's like, is there actually something beyond this? Yes, we'll talk about stuff beyond this in future episodes. We can have it even better than this.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. This is just the bare minimum.
Just a small smidgen of human potential.
All of this incomplete list that we have slogged through for this last however long in this conversation is just to get us to the bare fucking minimum.
Exactly.
I look forward to in our...
Demand the impossible.
Right. I look forward to, though, in our coming conversations to talk more about and imagine with you more about what is possible beyond this and what living in this space could be like, having these bare minimums of decency and dignity met.
Our hopes that when listening to this, you feel not just enraged and despairing, but like, God, we could totally do this.
We could fucking totally do this.
Let's do this. Let's just do this. Let's just start making it happen.
Yeah, like we detailed in our last conversation, our demand shouldn't be just housing is a human right, but free housing is a human right. Because our current common sense is all about property rights, and we need to recast that to be about human rights.
And this is an important thing to say when we talk about the potentiality for human flourishing, is that the denialists are the same as the doomsayers, the Twitter doomsayers. Is if we say that these are not possible, then it's no different than a denialist. The outcome is the extinction of the human civilization. And by giving into doom, which is the easiest thing to do when you go on Twitter, is just doom, doom, doom. It's a position of posture. It's a kind of naive nihilism. And if you give into that, it's the same as being a denialist in the Republican Party and being a death cult member, which means that we're going to be extinct. And we shouldn't be in that position. When we know that there's a possibility, it's like that phrase from Kim Stanley Robinson, the end of the world is already over. The real work begins. The world is over, right? We are in the climate catastrophe right now. We are in
big time
shit show. As Jesse was saying when he's coming to visit in LA, that, you know, it looks like the world's ending next week. Well, yeah, the world is ending, but we're going to create a new one out of it.
Yeah, a much fucking better one. One where the social contract isn't, as we said last time, pay rent or die. Where the American dream isn't to own a home, but is that no one owns a home because everyone has one.
They're not even dreams. They're just common factors of life. You know, get rid of the American, get rid of the dream. It just becomes everyday existence.
Everyday existence.
The golden square is just everyday existence.
It fucking should be. What I would be excited about is a potential reality where we're not working on these sort of insane problems of housing as a hyper commodity, but we're working on the problems to make better housing for all, where we're working to make things more diverse in terms of our architecture, where we're embracing in our urban sphere a diverse ecology of shapes and styles and modes and configurations of housing. We didn't touch on any of this.
It feels trivial, but the baseline and most heated arguments in a society with a golden square is aesthetics. People punch each other over aesthetics.
Well,
I want that world where we're punching each other over aesthetics, not fascism. But like we're having debates about aesthetics, and we're really having passionate discussions because we've met all of our basic needs.
Yeah, because as housing exists now, it's a homogenous monoculture of single-family homes. And not only is it boring, it's also just horrible for the fucking planet. It's horrible
for sex life, horrible for relations. It minimizes what children can be and become.
Yeah, so I mean, it's part of why we need to, as we've mentioned in other conversations, decenter the nuclear family. The conversations about home shouldn't be equating the home as a man's castle. It should be imagining it as a reparative, generative public good. And so how do we radically reimagine, reorganize the city so that all of it becomes public goods and that we make them more beautiful, more enjoyable, more sustainable, more luxurious public goods for all.
Absolutely.
Well, it's a long ways off, and this is just a partial map of that road to get there, but I think we need to commit to getting there. It's necessary.
Yeah, rainbow light, baby.
Heading towards that rainbow light. Well, thank you for going through this long conversation. Again, I think there's so much more to say about all of this.
But it was nice to go through this chart, and go through the chart yourself. I'll have it on the show notes for you. So work through it yourself and think about these things. So when you're talking to politicians or your community members, you're saying, well, these are these other options.
Yeah. All right. Well, till next time.
Cheers.